question now is, in more specific detail, what can we understand about the actual Geula process itself? Which means, what can we understand about the end? As Klal Yisrael and the world approaches the time when there's almost a complete Tahara, the world is now ready for the last jump in the total Tahara. You see, it's at that point that the Mashiach ben Yosef appears. The Mashiach ben Yosef, as the Mashiach, does not appear, even though the people who have that koyach, but the actual Mashiach does not appear. The actual Mashiach ben Yosef does not appear until the whole Bria is at the point when it has one more jump left to total Tahara. That's when he appears, because he is the climax to that process. He symbolizes its end. More than he symbolizes the end, he brings the end. He brings out that last jump. Now, the question is, what can we understand about that last jump? In order to understand that last jump, we have to know a lot more information. And it's not only information about the last jump involving the whole Indian of Klal Yisrael, the Mashiach and so on. It involves understanding much deeper things about the whole Indian of a Chet, what the Satan is, what the Chatoim are, and what the Kilkul in the Bri is. And we can't do that now. This will be the topic of our next series of Shurim, into much depth. But we can get a basic understanding of what's involved. Since the Chet of Adam Rishon, as we have said, the Nachash expanded into the Zohar, or actually he exuded a Zohar, which constituted his transformation into a different agent. An agent who's at war with man, who's an evil being, whose sole goal is to destroy man and make them all into non-Bechiraniks, if I may use the term, or people without any Bechira, or in other words, people who are fundamentally all like Amalek, and thus give himself a sense of absolute security. How does he do this? How was this done? Well, what happened is that his koyach entered into the very nature of man, his very personality. And by entering into the very personality of a person, he's able to manipulate the person in such a way as to cut off certain elements of his bechira. Now, I am not going to discuss what that entry was, how that entry took place, and the nature of that entry. That is a very, very deep discussion, and it will be the topic of our next series of Shurim. What I'm simply concerned with is the fact that by the Chet of Adam Rishon, the Zohar went not only into the body of Adam Rishon, it went not only into the substance of the entire world, it went not only on the neshama of Adam Rishon, as such, the Klippa, but it went into the very personality of Adam Rishon, and even more so, all the children, all the Toldos of Adam Rishon from that time on. It invaded the very nature of a person. And as it invaded that nature, it blocked certain levels of Bechira. What happens at the end is that Zohar invades the Mashiach ben Yosef as well. That process, or that aspect of the Zohar which invaded all men after Adam Rishon by the Chet, invade the Mashiach ben Yosef specifically. But the invasion on the Mashiach ben Yosef is very different than in all other men. Because the invasion on the Mashiach ben Yosef is an exact replica of the invasion of the Zohar in the Bria itself, mitchilasoi. It is a clone copy of the invasion of the Zohar onto Adam himself. Moreover, it is the invasion of the Zohar in the union of Mashiach ben Yosef that creates the entire Yisurin which is experienced in this case, and the entire union that we discussed about the Yisurin of the whole Mashiach itself. You see, that means that in order for the Geula to happen, all men must be restored to the Madrega of Adam Rishon before the Chet. It means that you've got to take the Zohar not only out of the Bria, you've got to take the Zohar out of the inner nature of man and restore all men to be 100% Baalei Bechira. The most singular effect that the entry of the Zohar into the Bria was that it made men into less Baalei Bechira. The more Chatoim, the less Baalei Bechira, you see. That means that Adam Rishon was the only person who ever experienced 100% Bechira. If the world is to go back to its time of total Tahara, which means that the world will go back to the matzav of Adam Rishon Kodem Achet, it means the world will go back to a situation where all mankind would be similar to Adam Rishon Kodem Achet, in the sense that they would have absolute Bechira. You see, without any equal, there would be no manifestation or expression of Zoyama in them at all, in their very personalities. This is what it means, fundamentally, to restore the Bria to the level of Adam Rishon Kodem Achet. Now, how will this be done? As we have said, the Zoyama which exists in all of Klal Yisrael, you see, is the same Zoyama which exists in the Mashiach ben Yosef himself, but in a much more clear example and so on. That's why when it says, V'hu mechulul mapsheinu, and the Mashiach is damaged because of our pshoim, because of our chatoim, it doesn't mean that he's suffering because of us. It means, not only that, it means that the very nature of the suffering, the very essence of the suffering itself, is an exact duplication of the consequence of the pesha, of the consequence of the entity of the Zoyama. One caused the exact structure of the other. It's a much deeper, you see, it's an exact parallel. In order to remove the last Zoyama from the Bria, how will that be done? The Medrash says, it's a Medrash in Yalkut Shimoni there, and Yeshaya there, the Medrash says a very interesting thing. And we can understand the ramification of what it says. It says there about, right when the Mashiach comes, by the Mashiach ben Yosef, by Ephraim, it says there that the Mashiach will raise himself, and then he will raise Klal Yisrael. It's a two-step process. What will happen is a very strange thing. First, the Mashiach will remove the Zoyama from himself. That's what it means. He will first raise himself. He will have the ability in some incredible fashion, and this fashion cannot be understood. You have to know much more information and so on, and there's a great deal that we yet don't understand about that. But what it fundamentally says is that the Mashiach ben Yosef, as an individual who will be living in the time of the Mashiach, who suffers from that Zoyama, and therefore experiences all the kilkul, which Klal Yisrael should have been experiencing, will free himself first from that kilkul. And thus, he will become the first man who will resemble Adam Rishon since the time of Adam Rishon. But the amazing thing is this, through his own efforts, but the amazing thing is this, that by freeing himself, he will understand how to free all mankind at the same time. That's the connection. He must free himself, and then he will free all of Klal Yisrael, and then finally all mankind. But he will be able to do it only through freeing himself. Once the world achieves the level of Tahara, in other words, once the world achieves the level of almost 100% Tahara, where it's at a point of 99.9% Tahara, suddenly the Mashiach ben Yosef will begin to understand or know exactly what's involved in removing the kilkul manifest in all human beings, and then remove it from himself, and then remove it from Klal Yisrael. That's fundamentally what happened. And at that point, once that Zoyama is lifted from the world, it begins to lift in other areas as well. You see. And we'll begin to explore this in a specific way. We have said many times, a while before, that the essence of the Inyan of Mashiach ben Yosef is to be megala, the Torah or the or, which is shayach to that particular kufa, for the tikkun of that kufa. We have said this many times. Just like Klal Yisrael is in the Zoyama, is in the Klippa, and therefore the Mashiach is in the Klippa, the Torah, the or Torah is also in the Klippa, so that Klal Yisrael is not zecha to be masig, the emes or of Torah or masig yechudai. That's the Klippa, the Kitzuk sees to it. Once the Mashiach has lifted off the Zoyama, he is now ready to lift off automatically, or actually it's lifted spontaneously at the same time. Three things happen. Three unbelievable things happen. When the time comes, when the Zohar lifts from the Mashiach ben Yosef, it lifts from the Shechina, where the Shechina goes out of the Klippa. No longer do we have Shechina Begalusa, and it leaves the Oris HaTorah, or the Or HaGonos. These three things happen at the same time, because it's the same event. It's the same event. The Shechina in the Golos is the Inyan of the Torah in the tremendous Klippas, and it's the Inyan of the Mashiach ben Yosef in the Klippas, or the Yechida in the Klippas, which is the Neshama of the Or HaGonos. You see, the Shechina is in the Klippas, the Yechida, which is the Malchus of the Mashiach, is in the Klippas, and the Mashiach as a person is in the Klippas. The removal of the Zohar, when the world is 99.9% free of Zohar, of Tumah, constitutes the liberation of all three at the same time, which is a staggering event. But the events don't take place simultaneously. They take place consecutively. What we will first see is not the liberation of Klal Yisrael at all. We will first see, when the Geula starts, is the liberation of the Mashiach, ben Yosef, the liberation of the Shechina, and the liberation of the Yechida. That is first. And there is a certain period of time from when that happens to when the time that it begins to spread to all of Klal Yisrael and then to the entire Bria. And that's what we have to discuss in more detail. Splitting himself out. And let's go into detail. What can we know about the process of Geula itself, which means the process whereby Klal Yisrael is lifted up from its massive in the Ikvat Mashiach, especially in time now where it's Be'ita, where it's Kula Chayavim, where Klal Yisrael in the world is very low, towards massive, where the Mashiach ben David reigns supreme, who's the Melech of the entire world, and the Malchus of the Ribono Shel Olam is Nika to the entire Bria. How will that Geula take place? How will that Yitzia from the tremendous Kittul and Sitru Achwa take place in this kind of way? There are a number of steps to this basic process. And as I said before, the entire process of Geula is essentially under the leadership, the Hanhoga of the Mashiach ben Yosef. The first Ika concept is you have to realize that Geula takes place in two stages. I've said a number of things. Last time I said we were Machalet that the Inyan of Geula takes place in two steps. One, that there's a removal, there's a separation of Kedusha from the Tumah, and then the second step, rather, that is the destruction of the Klippa. That's one way to look at it. There's another way to look at it. There's something called the Gulas HaGuf, and there's something called the Gulas HaNeshama. What do we mean? When we look at the Churban Beit HaMikdash, both the first and second, the first thing that Klal Yisrael experienced in terms of the Golos was the Golos of the Neshama. It means that the Romans and the Babylonians could do nothing, absolutely nothing, to the Beit HaMikdash at all before the Shechina left by itself. You see, the Shechina first left when the Ribono Shel Olam was Nigzar, Churban, Bayis Rishon, Bayis Sheni, and Golos. The first thing that happened was the fact that the Shechina lifted fundamentally and left. You see, so the first thing that went into Golos was the Neshama, or the Pnimius, the Ruchniistic aspect. That's the first thing that went into Golos. After that was gone, then the Goyim had the koyach to enter in and destroy the Guf, which is to destroy the Beit HaMikdash, Yerushalayim, and finally just conquer all of Eretz Yisrael and subjugate Eretz Yisrael for many years. That's the plot of Golos. First the Golos is in the Ruchnius and the Pnimius, and then it's the Chitzonius. The Geula, which is the reverse process, will take place exactly in the reverse way. When the Geula starts, first the Guf will be first constructed, and then when the Guf is basically completed, the Neshama then will be, or the Ruchnius will then be restored. So it's the reverse. The plot of Geula is the reverse of the plot of Golos, in that way. The plot of Golos is a process where first it affects the Neshama, the Pnimius, the Ruchnius of Klal Yisrael, and then their Guf the land of Israel. And then the part of Gula will first affect the Guf, or the land of Israel, and then the Neshama of Klal Yisrael, which is their Torah and their Ruchnius. So therefore, according to the scenario which I'm discussing here, it is obvious that before the Gula can happen, the Jews, the Gula, since it will take place first in the Guf of Klal Yisrael itself. There's a very, very important principle to understand about the rate of the Gula, the rate of the process itself, how it's going to take place. It's very critical to understand. If Klal Yisrael was Zeicha to the Yemot Mashiach by themselves, if they were really Zeicha, then the Gula would happen. When it would happen very rapidly. It would be almost in a very, very short period of time. Because once Klal Yisrael is Zeicha, and in a state of high tikkun, if they would have been Zeicha b'Achishena, then as soon as they would have reached a certain level of tikkun, the Gula would have started to happen very rapidly, and the Mashiach would appear very rapidly, and the entire matter would be done in a very short period of time. But if the Gula does not happen b'Achishena, if it happens b'Ita, where Klal Yisrael is not Zeicha, so therefore it happens by the case, and it happens when Klal Yisrael is Kula Chayavim, it means that it happens fundamentally to Hanugas HaYichud. To go by Hanugas HaYichud is a very slow process. A very slow process. And it has to go progressively, step by step, and stage by stage. Why? Why must it happen that way? If the Gula comes because of the Hanugas HaYichud, it goes much slower than if it comes from the Hanugas HaMishpat, which is with Achishena. Why? Because it has to do with the Kitrug and the Koyach of the Kitrug of the Satan. If the Gula has to come from the Hanugas HaYichud, it means Klal Yisrael is not Zoicha. You see, so the Kitrug is enormous. So that means the Bonishim has to bring each step in its own way, very slowly, so that in a certain sense it's not noticeable. You see, if Klal Yisrael was Zoicha and Achishena, then the Bonishim is not concerned with the Kitrug of the Satan. So therefore, you start it and you finish it, and that's the end of it. But if Klal Yisrael is not Zoicha, that means that every step of the Gula has a new Kitrug, a new thing, which means that the Bonishim has to be constantly dealing with the Kitrug, step by step by step, because the Kitrug will block every step of the Gula. So because of that, the Gula has to take place very slowly. Chazal said this a long time ago, and so on. I'm not clear what the Gemara is, but there were two Tanoim, I believe, or Memorim, I'm not clear. They were once walking, and they came, I think they were walking in Merom, I'm sure, and they saw the dawn. And so one said to the other, this is the way the Gula will take place. You see, how will it take place? He said the following. First there's the darkness, there's the night, and then there's the dawn. If you analyze the process of the night and so on, the darkest part of the night is right before the dawn. In other words, the night, as it goes from day to night, right, the night becomes dark and gets darker and darker and darker, until as it approaches close to the dawn, it's the darkest of the night. That's the darkest. That's the end of the Golus. If the Golus has to take place, so that it lasts a long time, be'ita, so that it has a full length, you see, right? It means that it's going to get blacker and blacker as the Golus goes. And that's the Yevdik's Mashiach of what do you call it, of Kula Chayafim. That as it gets closer and closer to the case, it looks worse and worse in the Bria, in that sense. But as soon as the night has its maximum darkness, what's the first thing that happens? The first thing that happens is suddenly the light of the sun appears. Not the guf. It's what's called the Netzachama, Adialois Shachar, not the Nate. The first thing that we see is not the disk of the sun itself. The first thing is the light, you see. And then slowly, the light begins to shine. The first rays begin to pierce through the darkness. And very slowly, it begins to go on and on and on until after a certain amount of time, let's say an hour later, suddenly the disk of the sun itself breaks over the horizon. So one of the Chazal, the Chachamim said to the other, this is the same way that the Gula will take place. Kima. Step by step. It will go first from the darkest period, and then when the dawn starts, which is the Gula, you will begin to see the first rays of light. The first rays of light. But this rays of light will slowly become stronger and stronger and stronger, until finally the rays of light will be so powerful that the actual generator of the light will be there. So the light will be in its full bloom. That's the Netzachama. And that's the process of the Gula itself. Thus we see very clearly that when the Hanugas HaYichud controls the Gula, the rate is much slower than what Hanogas HaMishpat controls. That's the fundamental principle. That the rate is very slow, and that the entire Gula goes step by step by step. This is the basic principle. And according to this principle, we begin to assess and evaluate the various different maisim or events that will occur in that time. Now, let's go back to the events, now that we've understood the concept of the rate. The first thing is the Gulat HaGuf, which means that before the Ruchnis comes back to Klal Yisrael, while Klal Yisrael is still in the Klippa, that's why the Ruchnis doesn't come back. And while the Mashiach ben Yosef is still in the Klippa, you see, we're both in the Klippa in what's called the Ikvat Mashiach, which is the generation before Klal Yisrael experiences the Gula. That's still the Golus. It's the darkest period. Both the Mashiach ben Yosef and Klal Yisrael are both heavily in the Klippas. We've described the Klippa of Klal Yisrael before. We've described the Klippa of the Mashiach also. The first thing that will begin to indicate the beginning of the Gula is the return of Eretz Yisrael. And the Maharal says this openly, that the first thing that the Gula will symbolize is that the Jews will get back the land of Israel. You see. But one of the ways that the Gula happens very slowly is when it happens B'derech HaTeva. That's it. When it happens B'derech HaTeva, it's very concealed and it's very slow. And this is what happens. The entire Gula process, which is run by the Hanogas HaYuchas, happens slowly. Not only does it happen slowly, but it happens concealed. In other words, it's completely couched and concealed in Teva. You see. Which means that the land of Israel will be returned to the Jews not by some Nes Min Shemayim or some war, you see, with Klal Yisrael using Nisim and so on. It will happen B'derech HaTeva. And strangely enough, in certain ways, that's what we observe basically now, in this kind of sense. But this is what will happen. Klal Yisrael will be restored to its land slowly, B'derech HaTeva, up to a certain point in time. Once the land is fundamentally completed, and the land exists for Klal Yisrael in its basic things, then starts the Gula of the Ruchnis itself. You see. But the truth of the matter is, and we can really see this in many ways, what's going on today in Eretz Yisrael, in this way. When we say the Gulat HaGuf, we refer to many different stages. Because you have to remember, the Kitrik is enormous and the Kitrik is constant. And the Rebbeinu constantly has to deter the Kitrik at every step of the way. So that even though the Jews have the land of Israel, they still cannot live in it b'shalom. You see. So therefore, it's a total step where first they retrieve the land, and then slowly they begin to live in it b'shalom. But as long as they live in the land under the threat of annihilation, the Kittuk is still enormous. I see. So the progression of the Gulat HaGuf is also progression. It's a progression where the first thing which is experienced is the return of the land, and the next thing which is experienced is sovereignty in the land, of all the land, also that step by step. And finally, the third thing which is experienced is shalom in the land, acceptance, when there are no longer any enemies outside attempting to annihilate Klal Yisrael because of the fact that they have been restored to their land. You see, look, it's a three-step process. And it's interesting enough, if you want to apply to current events, we see this exactly what happens. After World War II, which is the most greatest annihilation of Klal Yisrael, and obviously, as I said before in the Shur before, it was the disintegration of Esav. As the biggest klippa of Klal Yisrael and Amalek, the Yidden got back Eretz Yisrael. But the Kittuk was such that the Hanogas HaYuchas demanded that the klippa still be very, very heavy, so that there's no appearance of any kind of frumkeit in Eretz Yisrael. But the next step is to slowly begin to acquire the land itself, more and more pieces, larger and larger as it goes along. Until finally, the third step is the final removal of the threat to that land itself, and where the Jews live in that land of peace. Once the body or the guf of the Gula is established, then starts the Ruchnis itself, which is the return of Klal Yisrael to its former glory, its former pnimius, its former awe. We see therefore that in the process of Golus takes place first by the Golus of the Ruchnius, of the Neshama of Klal Yisrael, which is the Shechina, and then there's the Golus of the Chetonius, which is the Guf, that constitutes the bias itself, and Eretz Yisrael. in the way that the Golus takes place, the Geula will take place in reverse. First the Guf will be restored, and after the Guf is restored, which is Eretz Yisrael itself, then the Neshama of Klal Yisrael will be restored in the sense of the Oresh Mashiach will arrive, and then the Beit HaMikdash will be built with the Kibbutz Goliath, all Klal Yisrael will go back, and then the Neshama of Klal Yisrael will come back, O Chodesh Al Tzion To'ira. That's what the thing is. Now, what we have to do now is to go into Arichas of what does it mean the Gulas HaNeshama. How will the Ruchnius come back to Klal Yisrael? Well, fundamentally, to go into that is to explore in some detail, as best as we can, what the process will be of the Mashiach ben Yosef. Because as we said many times, the Geula process is controlled or in the hands of the Mashiach ben Yosef. The Mashiach ben Yosef, who is responsible of lifting up Klal Yisrael and the world from the Klippa which is in, and removing the Klippa forever. In other words, there's Mashiach ben Yosef, who we said many times, who has to be Matayah the Bria from the Zoyama, or to Matayah the Bria from the Tumah. And that means lifting up the Klippa from the Bria, so that Klal Yisrael is restored in Eretz Yisrael with Ruchnius. Now, the main thing that the Mashiach ben Yosef is responsible for is the union of not only Gulas Naguf, but mainly the Gulas the Neshama. And as we said, that the Neshama, the Torah, which is fundamentally the Or of Klal Yisrael of Ruchnius, is in the Klippa. The Inish of Klal Yisrael is that first Biyatzor, Uzucha B'Shevi, V'Fatcha Biyatzor, means that the Or Torah, the Hasog of Gilui Chudai, in its panemius, in its greatest form, is in the Klippa. And it is the Mashiach ben Yosef who fundamentally is the individual who will raise that Or out of the Klippa so that the world at that time could be used for tikkun. And we went through the whole thing about Moshe Rabbeinu and Adam and Noach and Moshe Rabbeinu, and finally the end, the climactic Mashiach ben Yosef himself. So it is the main function of every Mashiach ben Yosef to introduce into the world the Or Torah, which is shaykh to that world in terms of giving the world the tikkun that it needs to go on. That's the essential definition of the Mashiach ben Yosef. The Mashiach ben David does not do that. Mashiach ben David does not reveal that Torah. You see, because simply the Mashiach ben David, and we'll get to that later, is not fundamentally, is not concerned with the Tahara of the Bria. His concern is Mekadosh the Bria, to elevate the Bria from a state of Chassan to a state of Shlemus, but not to elevate the Bria from a state of Tumah to a state of Tahara. That's the concern of the Mashiach ben Yosef. The concern of the Mashiach ben David is to elevate it from Chassan to Shlemus, which is fundamentally to elevate the Bria to a state of Zichuch or Kedusha, which is to bring the world from the state of Adam Rishon before the Chet to the state of Olam Haba. And that is why that will take place after the whole Indian of Mashiach ben Yosef. We have to explore the Indian of Mashiach ben Yosef much more carefully in its detail to see what we can understand of how it's going to take place. We start with the fundamental status of the world right before the Yom Mashiach. The period of time in the world before the Yom Mashiach is called the Ikvas Mashiach. And that is a generation which is right before the Yom Mashiach itself, the Bias HaMashiach itself. What is the nature of that generation? Well, it depends on Klal Yisrael itself. If Klal Yisrael is Kulas Hadikim, Kulas Zakoyim, you see, then the state of the Ikvas Mashiach is a very high state. The very high state of very big Tzadikim. So the Yom Mashiach is not really, it's not climactic. You know, it is a slightly higher state. Because Klal Yisrael would have achieved tremendous tzidkus by itself. But if the Yom Mashiach appears be'ita, because of the case, because the Klal Yisrael is not zercha, so the Ikvas Mashiach represents Klal Yisrael in a state of tremendous hashchosa and kilkul. So therefore, the Yom Mashiach which will come after it will be a sudden and dramatic elevation, which will shock. It's going to be such a profound shock that if it were the equivalent of a person looking into the face of the sun, he would instantly become blind. That's the sudden dramatic element of that. And as we've said before, because of the fact that Klal Yisrael is in a state of hashchosa, the Mashiach is also in a state of hashchosa. And we gave a whole shir on what that state is and what's the circumstance of the Mashiach ben Yosef in this particular state. But we're dealing here where both Mashiach and Klal Yisrael are in a state of amius, in a state of hashchos, a state of kilkul. So obviously, when we're talking about the beginning of the Gula of the Neshama of Klal Yisrael, the beginning of the Or, we've got to see a process where we're beginning to lift from the Klippa. Now, how does this process take place? How does Klal Yisrael begin to lift itself up from the Klippa? The process will start with Siyuf from the Klipa, which is the first stage of the Mashiach Ben Yosef process, is the Yitziyah min HaKlipas. How will that occur? Fundamentally, it will occur to the Mashiach first, and not the Klal Yisrael. The first one who will lift himself up from the Klipa itself, which holds him, is the Mashiach Ben Yosef himself. Now, this is a very deep matter. A very deep matter. How is this to take place? And so on. And the truth of the matter is, I will just briefly mention how this is to take place, how I believe it will take place. But the way that it will ultimately take place requires a great deal of more information, because the process of the Yitziyah from the Klipa of the Mashiach Ben Yosef himself is connected to the panemius of the Bria, to the panemius of the essence of Chet itself, to the Chet of Adam Rishon. And it is very, very deep. I'm reserving the topic in detail at length for another series of Shurim. It's very deep, and it has profound implications about the nature of the Yetzer himself. We spoke about that a little bit, but even more profound of what the panemius of the Sitlach is, and how the Satan affects the Bria, how it affects the Mashiach Ben Yosef, and the battle between the Mashiach Ben Yosef and the Satan himself. That's really what it involves. Because funny what it is. The Mashiach Ben Yosef is at war with the Satan, because his job is to lift the Satan off the Bria. In order to do it, he's at war with the Satan, and by being at war with the Satan, he also has to lift it off from the entire world. This is no easy job. Now, the only reason why the Mashiach Ben Yosef could do it in the first place, the truth is, the Mashiach Ben Yosef cannot do it straight alone. It's a very difficult job, because the Kitrug would hold the Klipa, the Satan in place, can't be removed. The Klipa is very steadfast. So basically, the question here is, the Yitziyah min HaKlipa is a very, very difficult task. Now, the only way the Mashiach Ben Yosef will be able to get himself out of his own Klipa is if Klal Yisrael is ready to get out of their Klipa. What will get Klal Yisrael out of their Klipa? The Yisurin and the Schusim of Klal Yisrael itself. It's got to work its way over time, that the Hanukkah Yichud sees to it, that through the Yisurin and the Tzoros that come on Klal Yisrael, and the Tshuva, and Bechal, just the Shlita, the Tigbur Salah that comes on Klal Yisrael, eventually Klal Yisrael itself will wear down its own kitrug and its own klipa, where it comes to the point when 99.9% of the klipa, or the kitrug on Klal Yisrael, will have been spent. That already happened by Yetzias Mitzrayim. Right at the end of Yetzias Mitzrayim, when the Vanishim said to Moshe Rabbeinu, Vayishma Tnakotim, I have heard. You see, remember, I have heard. And what about before? Before I have not heard. Why did I heard? Because the Midas Hadin was so strong that the Vanishim could not listen to the Torah of Klal Yisrael. But there finally came a certain point when Klal Yisrael had achieved so much from Shibud, so much removal of Tahara from the Zoyama, from the Klipa. So the I hear now. Now I can begin the process of Geula. Why? Only because they've worked through their own Klipa. You see, you've got to deal with the Kitrug. You can't just take the Kitrug and put him aside. The Bonisha must deal with him, because the Kitrug comes from the Tikkun of Nam Tzuv itself. It comes from the Almongas HaMishpah, which is more critical than Almongas HaYichud from that standpoint. You see. So what happens is, the Geula will not start to happen until Klal Yisrael reach the point when they will achieve 99.9% of the removal of the Klipa by itself already. The Mashiach Ben Yosef appears when, let's say, I don't know the exact figure, when there's 0.01 left of that Klipa. I don't know if it's 0.01, whatever it is, a certain fraction of the Klipa. Then the Mashiach Ben Yosef will have the clear to remove it all. Before that, he cannot. It is impossible. And if he succeeded, he would destroy the Bria. Like I said once or if the Mashiach Ben Yosef would succeed to remove the Klipa before its time, meaning, how would he do that? If he brought out the Or Torah that's unique to him, the Or Torah that he would have to be Megala, he would be Machud the Bria. If Moshe Rabbeinu had known the Torah in its actual Tzura before he would have been Megala on Sinai, it would have been destroyed, the entire Bria. The whole Bria would have been destroyed. And we explained this once before, because if it would have been brought out, there would have been a sudden kitrug on that ore, in such a way that the Banishim would not have been able to bring the Geula. The kitrug would have destroyed the entire Hanogas HaYichud. You see, that's the whole thing. It's a very deep mechanism. We'll go into it later on, but if you remember, we spoke about this before. You see, that you cannot be Megala Kedusha before its time. To be Megala before its time means to take it away from the Satan. That's what it means. Because if it's not there in the world, who has it? The Satan has it. Because the world is not Zoicha. The Kituk of the Satan means that he holds the Kedusha in his hand. To take away the Kedusha before its time means to reveal, to open up the Kedusha in a state of Kitur. You see. And instantly the Satan becomes aware of the fact that the Kedusha is outside and that the world should not be Zoicha to it. And he suddenly sees this fact. And he can be, his Kitur can manage to ma'ab with the Bria. So the Mashiach ben Yosef cannot function whatsoever until the time has come. It's a din in Zman. That's what it is. It's a din in time. No amount of tefillah, no amount of tzedakah, no amount of mitzvahs will do it. Will allow the Mashiach ben Yosef to be able to do it unless Klal Yisrael suddenly picks themselves up in a tremendous avodah and tshuva and so on. But unless that happens, it's got to take time. Means that there has to be a certain amount of yisuin, there has to be a certain amount of shibud that must take place. That's what's called. That's what we call the Chevnei HaMashiach. It's the last thing, the Chevnei HaMashiach, which is menaka, which cleans out Klal Yisrael in preparation for the Mashiach himself. But the Mashiach is totally on Klal Yisrael. That's why it's very important to understand. That's why when Klal Yisrael did the Chet of the Egel, remember the Baruch said Lech Rei. He said to Moshe Rabbeinu, go down. What do you mean? But the Baruch was saying to Moshe Rabbeinu, Lech Rei mi Mashiachos. Go down. You are no longer the Mashiach. Why not? What does Moshe do? Because what happened is Klal Yisrael reintroduced a new klipa on them. So what good is a Mashiach when there's a new klipa? You know what I mean? A Mashiach cannot function in the state of a klipa. The only thing that happens is the Mashiach himself has to go into the klipa. That's the contract, you see. So once Klal Yisrael did the Chet of the Egel and they brought a new klipa in that kind of sense, they destroyed the entire passage of the Gula. So therefore Moshe also had to go into the klipa, and he did. He died in the Midbar with them. In Moab, in the land, in the klipa of the Erevav. That's where he is. You see. So that's the thing. So it's a very critical thing to understand. There's a very unique relationship between Klal Yisrael and the Mashiach himself. A very important relationship. Now this relationship has to be studied in a number of ways. You see. And I think I went into this, but I think it's important to go into this concept here. What is the relationship between the Mashiach and Klal Yisrael himself, especially the Mashiach ben Yosef? And we can see this in a number of places. We see very clearly that when Klal Yisrael frustrates the Geula, then the Mashiach ben Yosef suddenly is out of a job. Klal Yisrael can put the Mashiach ben Yosef out of a job. We see that. Right? We see that from Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, what about Fakir? Can the Mashiach ben Yosef put Klal Yisrael out of a job? In other words, let's say Klal Yisrael is ready for the Geula and the Mashiach ben Yosef does something wrong. Where do we see such a case? By Yerom ben Nevat. Right? What happened over there? It was Yerom ben Nevat that did the Chatoim. So the question is, can he do that? Well, to see this more closely, we'd have to examine the Indian of Purim by Esther, by Mordechai. When Mordechai came to Esther and he said to her, you're in a very unique position. And he said, you see. So what he said to Esther was the following. I want you to know this. He says, Klal Yisrael is ready for Geula. It's clear, it's on. But you're in the obvious position to bring that Geula for Klal Yisrael. But it's up to you. In other words, even though Klal Yisrael is in a state of Geula, there's a very important thing, that the Mashiach ben Yosef is still in a state of Nesuyin. In other words, there's two factors here. Klal Yisrael itself has to be Zoicha to a Geula, and if they're Zoicha to Geula, then they can wait for it. But the Mashiach ben Yosef, in order for him to be Mashiach ben Yosef, he has to be Zoicha lekach. It's a double Nesuyin, you see. So in other words, what Mordechai said to Esther is that in this case, you're the one who has to bring this Geula, you and me. But if you fail to bring it, I want you to know, you will lose out the schus to being Mashiach, this Indian of Mashiach ben Yosef. Somebody else will come, but Klal Yisrael will still have its Gula because they're the ones who start. So we see a very interesting thing, that the whole Gula rests on Klal Yisrael. That's where it begins and that's where it ends. If Klal Yisrael is Zoicha to Gula, then suddenly a Mashiach ben Yosef appears. But whether or not this will be the Mashiach ben Yosef depends on himself. He himself has to work on his own avodah and be omer ben Nesuyin so that he should be zoicha to be Mashiach ben Yosef in that sense, you see. If he fails, then another Mashiach ben Yosef appears to take over the thing. If he passes, then he becomes the Mashiach ben Yosef. However, if Klal Yisrael is not zoicha to the Gula, no matter how big the Mashiach ben Yosef is, he falls with them. You see what I'm saying? That's what we see by Mordechai and Esther and the Indian of Moshe Rabbeinu. What about the Indian of Yerom ben Nevat? What happened over there? Yerom ben Nevat did the Agolim. He was over that Avodah Zarah. So he fundamentally what he did was, he seemed to have destroyed the entire thing. But the answer is that it wasn't him that destroyed the Gula. Klal Yisrael destroyed the Gula. Why? Because the Roman of us picked himself up and he started worshipping the calves and so on, which is actually the name of Yosef, and he convinced Klal Yisrael to do it. But if Klal Yisrael would have been on the Emes Madrega, they would not have listened to Yerav Minavat. So what would have happened is Yerav Minavat would have fallen, and Klal Yisrael would have been Zercha to a new Mashiach. But the simon was, since the Klal Yisrael itself also worshipped the Agolim, the 10 tribes, it was a simon that they also weren't worthy for Gula. You see, so both fell. The 10 tribes went into Golas, right? Asor Shvatim, and Yerav Minavat died, and the whole Inni Mashiach went into the Klippa. You see what I'm saying? It was a simon of that kind of thing. But that's basically what it is. So, in the end, so we see clearly the relationship between the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Mashiach ben David, especially Mashiach ben Yosef and Klal Yisrael, in terms of who is Meicha and who. You can see there's a very tight relationship between the two. You see, where it really starts in Klal Yisrael, Yemot Mashiach comes by Klal Yisrael, and they determine the Atzlach of Mashiach ben Yosef. But in addition, Mashiach ben Yosef has to also determine his own Atzlach. That means that the Mashiach ben Yosef himself has to be Zercha to be a Mashiach ben Yosef. It's not just an assigned matter and that's the end of it.
What about
so therefore, what we see is the following. What we see is that the Mashiach ben Yosef cannot operate unless Klal Yisrael is already in the Madrega, is Muchal and Mezuman for the Moshe Mashiach. Then, at that point, represents the climactic point when suddenly the Mashiach ben Yosef appears. And here is where I have to look into. We're now assuming, you see, that already the Klippa is already loose. It's very loose and it just lays on Klal Yisrael in a much looser way. The connection is not tight anymore. And there's only a small amount left. And remember I said the other time, I don't care what you're going to tell me about the Tikboyer Sarah. I don't care how much you're going to show me is going on out there. In terms of the koyach of the Satan. It doesn't mean anything. Because it is not, the amount of sheker which exists in the world is not a barometer of the true koyach of the Satan himself. In reality. That's the deception. You see. The true koyach of himself is the amount of sheker which exists in the world, with the world being a state of total bechira. That's really the amount. If he can get a world which is full of bechira to do complete sheker, then he's very powerful. For example, like the Doar Mabul. You see, when most of mankind is in a state of bechira, you see, and he gets the entire world to become Rishoyim, then you're dealing with a very powerful figure, the Satan. But for him to get over the world to do Averis, when most of the world is very Lushayach to bechira, is simply a demonstration of not of his true power, but simply of his residence. He simply resides in all these people. But that doesn't mean necessarily a shlita in that kind of sense. It doesn't mean he's becoming more powerful as a result, in a real way. The question now is therefore to examine more specifically and more closely the Yitzir of the Klippas of the Mashiach himself. The Mashiach ben Yosef, like we said, there's always that relationship between Klal Yisrael and the Mashiach ben Yosef. Even Be'ita, we have to examine this also in this thing. And this is the thing that we have to be clear to understand. If Klal Yisrael is not Zoich to the Mashiach Ba'achishena, they're going to be Zoich Be'ita, right? Which is the second mode, right? I say that if Klal Yisrael is Zoich to the Yemot Mashiach Be'ita, then it's totally from the Anogas HaYichud. Therefore the Mashiach is Zoich Be'ita and only from the Anogas HaYichud. There's no Nesoyin which is Shaykh to Mashiach ben Yosef. Really. In that situation. If the whole thing goes down to the case, it just goes. That's it. However, there's a third mode, which the Vilna Gaon pointed out, which is called Be'it Achishena. In other words, that we're going to come right down to the case, but we'll be able to accelerate it a little bit in advance. You see. To accelerate it a little bit in advance, when it's down to the Be'ita, but an Achishena Be'ita, I'll speed up the case. To do that means that there's a little mishpat left. If there's a little mishpat, that means that the Mashiach ben Yosef is still shaykh to a shtik nesoyin. There's an inyan of nesoyin. And we explained in nesoyin the whole thing of what the nature of those nesoyinis are. You see. And it is possible that what happens is chas v'sholom, if the Mashiach ben Yosef in that thing of Brit Achishena should fail, or if Klal Yisrael fails in that mode, that's it. Then they're going to go down to the end, to the case. Because Klal Yisrael is what determines the thing. However, if it comes out that Mashiach ben Yosef failed, and not Klal Yisrael, then another one will replace him. You see. Will replace him, or if not replace him, then it's difficult to say. That it may go a little further down to the end. It's hard to say. It's hard to say. It depends on how close it is, you see. And I believe that what we're dealing with now is we're dealing with a Akishena. We're dealing with an acceleration, which means that there's still a little room for Kitrug. There's still a little room for Kitrug.
That seems more sense.
Now, the question is, again, how will this transpire in what way? The first step of the Yetzirah Klippa belongs to Mashiach. Assuming that Klal Yisrael is Zoicha and everything is ready, then the first step is the Yetzirah Klippa of Mashiach himself. The Mashiach ben Yosef must remove himself from his Klippa. You see. Now, what does it mean that the Mashiach ben Yosef must remove himself from the Klippa? What it fundamentally means is this, and without elaborating in detail, the chet of Adam Rishon, when Adam Rishon did a chet, and he brought the tumah into the bria, he affected his inner being. He affected his inner personality and his very being in such a way that the tumah went into him. You see, as you said before, which is very critical, and this is again must be reiterated very carefully, that when the Baruch Shem told Adam, don't do a chet, right? If you do a chet, tumah will enter the bria. Tumah entered the bria in three different areas. When he did the chet, tumah entered into the entire bria itself, into the substance of all creation. That's why we need Tchiyas HaMetim. You have to be matar the guf of the bria. Adam was matama the guf of the bria, the chetzonis of the bria. Because the Zoyma entered into the substance of this world. That's the first entry. The second entry was into himself, into his own neshama. The Klippa went onto his neshama, and therefore into his very being, his very personality, his very thinking process. It also went in. And the third way it went into the Yetzer Hara himself. It went into the Satan himself. Because before the Chet of Adam Rishon, the Satan had no tumah. He simply was shoylet on the koyach of tumah. He was able to use the koyach of tumah in order to try and seduce men to do a sin. But tumah was not part of him, as we've said a number of times. The Satan himself was a regular malach, free of tumah. He simply had shlita over tumah to use it to attempt to seduce man to do chatoim. You see. But when man did the Chet, the Satan was cursed also, as we see that the Baruch Shem cursed the Nachash. And what the Baruch Shem did was that suddenly the tumah spread out and went into the Satan himself and converted him into a totally evil being, an evil malach, who now wants to destroy man, who sees himself as competitive man, and realizes that he must destroy man in order for him to survive. All these things happen because of the Chet of Adam Rishon. You see. Now, basically, after the Chet of Adam Rishon, we see that three things happened. The Satan was changed, the substance of the world was changed, and Adam Rishon was changed. His personality, his very being, right? The reason why the Mashiach ben Yosef is in the Klippa is why? Because fundamentally the Klippa that he's in is the same Klippa that attacked Adam Rishon also. And therefore, what the Mashiach ben Yosef tries to do fundamentally to all mankind is the Mashiach ben Yosef is successful in being matar the Bria. What does he do? It means that he's beginning to lift the Tumah, the Zoyma from the entire world. Well, how? He lifts it first of all from humanity. He will actually incredibly take the Zoyma, the Tumah, as it's manifest in every neshama, and take it out. You see, that's number one. Number two, he will take it away from the Satan and reconvert the Satan back to what he was before. And finally, he will take it out of the Bria. You see. Now, what does that mean? That means that Mashiach ben Yosef, by being matar the Bria, he will be matar all mankind, so he will reinstate all men to the madreg of Adam Rishon Koydem Achet. Now, I don't know if you know what this means. And I know you don't know what this means. But I say to you this, that when that process takes place, when the Mashiach ben Yosef converts all men, you see, by removing the Zoyma of all men, whatever that is, we're not going to define that, that's for another time. When he takes that Zoyma out of all men, every person will change. And every person will realize the change suddenly. every person will be a totally different person. You see, like it says in the pasuk, what it says, Leiv Torah B'Orei Lekim. The Bereshit created a Leiv Torah, right? Adam Rishon was born with a Leiv Torah, without any Zoyama, right? But what David HaMelech says is Leiv Torah B'Orei Lekim. The Bereshit created me in emes with Tahara. You see, Ruach Nochon Chadesh B'Kirbi. But it's a tefillah. What David is saying is that the Bereshit should restore us back to a Ruach Nochon. You know, he's asking the Bereshit to bring all men back to the conscious awareness that Adam had, which is a staggering thing. Chadesh Yameinu Pekedem. That's what the Mashiach ben Yosef will do. So therefore, this is the Nekuda. The Mashiach ben Yosef fundamentally will remove the Zoyama of all men, and therefore we totally transform their very personalities and their very states of being. All men will think differently, will feel differently, will act differently once that Zoyama is out. You have no asugah what a feeling that is or what that will be. It will be like a rebirth. Every man will suddenly get up like, wait a minute, this is incredible. And that's when it says over the by Shia Malos, we were all like dreamers, right? Because what happened is, when the Adam did the Chet and the tumor went in the Bria, it went into the very personality and minds of all men and began to limit his Bechira. As it did that, it began to split man from himself, so that he wasn't in full control. That's why he's like a dreamer. It's like a person in a dream who sees things and so on but has no control over himself, really. You see. And suddenly what would happen is, when this Zoyama leaves, people will suddenly, it's like waking up. Wait a minute, we were like dreamers. You know, there seemed to be a whole part of me, a whole aspect of my consciousness, which somehow I never was aware of. It was like a dreamlike state. You see. That's what I mean, that's what the Mashiach ben Yosef will do. He will restore mankind to a totally awake state with the same conscious aspect that Adam Rishon before the Chet had. You see. Not yet with the same Kedusha, but with the same conscious aspect of his mind that, that Adam had, so on. But before he can do this to mankind, he must first do it to himself. That's what it means, Yitzhak from the Klippa. The Yitzhak Klippa from the Mashiach ben Yosef means to remove himself from the state of Zoyama, which binds him, which is reflective of the original Chet of Adam Rishon. You see, and it binds him. And when he frees himself from that, he will awaken with full force and full koyach. You see, and he will understand how to restore man to this particular state. Mind you, this will happen to the Mashiach ben Yosef first. It will happen to no one else, and nobody will know about it. Nobody will know about this. This will only be done by the Mashiach ben Yosef himself with a special siyata d'shmaya. You see, we're now talking about the beginning of the Gulus HaNeshama of the Yeruchnius, and we're starting with the Mashiach ben Yosef himself. He will do this. You see. Now, one of the things which are involved in this, and I want to say a very important thing, is the end of the Pa'aduma. Because the mystery of removing the Zoyam of the Bria really rests in the side of the Pa'aduma. As we said, the Pa'aduma reflects the Hanogas HaYichud in many ways. You see, it reflects the ultimate activity of the Hanogas HaYichud itself. How you can Matah Tohem, Matah Tomem, and Matah Tohem at the same point, which is the Satan, which is like a Tega and Senega in one, a duality, you see. And the third of how this is possible is in the Pa'aduma. If we understood the mystery of the Pa'aduma, which only Moshe Rabbeinu knew, you see, we would know how to remove the Zoyam of the Bria. It's in the Pa'aduma, it's in the mystery. And we said, why did Moshe Rabbeinu only himself know it? Because Chal Yisrael was Zeicha to a time when the Zoyam left. So since the Zoyam left the Bria, right before the Chet of the Ego, so the Or, which has to do, the Or Chochmah, which has to do with this, came down, so Moshe understood it. But once the Zoyam came back, it couldn't be understood anymore. So Shlomo Melech couldn't understand it anymore. As big as the Chochmah Shlomo Melech was, he could not understand the Inyan of the Pa'aduma. Why? Because the Pa'aduma contains the mystery of how the Zoyam leaves the Bria. But since the time of Shlomo Melech, the Zoyam was in the Bria, meaning that it was in the Klippa and the Satan. The Chochmah, the Pa'aduma, is in the hands of the Satan. You see? It's in the hands of the Satan. If it's in the hands of the Satan, Shlomo could not pull it out. Nobody could know it. Because the mystery is in the hands of the Satan himself, the Mekasik himself. Not that he knows it, but it's in his hands and he won't release it. Because he knows it's a threat to him. yet he may not understand what's involved because he does not know the meaning of the Seder of the Paul Duma. Like Rashi says over there, that something says, he also, what do you call it, is Makanta Kala Yisrael about the Paul Duma. There's something the Ummah Olam do not know the mystery of the Paul Duma. But the ore is in the hands of the Sultan, and he will not release it. As long as he has shlit on the Bria, he has shlit on the ore of Torah, which has to do with the Paul Duma. You see? And that all has to do. So, what we're saying here is that when the Mashiach ben Yosef releases himself from the Klippa, by releasing himself, the Zohar which is in him, you see, which has differentiated man and which has removed man from the Madreg of Adam Rishon for the Chet, he will begin to understand the story of the Paul Duma will begin to come down to himself, and as it comes down, he will then have the tool and the weapon in his hand to matar all mankind from the ultimate pagam which was set on it from the Chet of Adam Rishon. But this is the Indian of Mashiach ben Yosef. This is what he will do. He will free himself of the Zohar of Adam Rishon, and by doing that he will understand the mechanism of that Zohar through the Seder of the Paul Duma. And once he does that, he will free all of mankind, which the Pasuk says, Leiv Torah Boilekim Ruach Nochoin Chadesh B'Kirbi. Give me a Leiv Torah again. You see, what does the Leiv Torah mean? Let me be the kind of person that Adam Rishon before the Chet was. Let me have that level of consciousness, that level of awareness, that level of being. You see. And in order to explain what that is, we'll have to go into later on, but just to experience that release is an incredible state. And that, I want you to know, that is not a state of Kedusha yet. We haven't touched Kedusha. That's simply a state of removal of Tumah, you see. Later on I will explain to you what the mechanism of that is and what the nature of that state is. You'll understand it much better. See? But right now, it's only the first state. The first state is the Yitzhak from the Klippa, which is an incredible state itself. But again, the Mashiach ben Yosef does it to himself first, with everyone unawares. It is a mystery and a secret unknown to him, and it will be done by him in private and secretly. It's not done with anyone else. You see, first he lifts himself up. Now, once he has lifted himself up, what happens then? He is now out of the Klippa. Now, mind you, I want to say a very, very important thing. The removal of the Klippa of the Mashiach ben Yosef is a staggering event. Why? Because it's more than just represents the personal freedom of the individual, of the Mashiach ben Yosef himself. And obviously, it's a removal of his hashchasa, you know what I mean? The chains which have always held him, a tremendous yoke on his neck, and he describes the chains that have held him, is suddenly removed. Those chains, so it constitutes an incredible personal achievement himself. It's like it's a new era for him. But it has another ramification which is literally staggering. The removal of the Klippa from the Mashiach ben Yosef, he's going out, represents the most staggering event in all history. It means that the Shekhinah picks up and leaves the Klippa. Now, why is that significant? That is incredibly significant. Why? And this is the thing. What exactly is the Shekhinah? The Shekhinah is that aspect of the Bnei Shalom, which represents the union of Olam Haba. When it says in Olam Haba, what is Olam Haba? Tzadikim Yoshvim, V'ituseim Hashem, V'nenim Meziva Shechina. Olam Haba is nothing more than Gili Yehuda, right? Gili Yehuda of what? Of the Bnei Shalom. What of the Bnei Shalom? The Shechina. The Shechina is the aspect of the Bnei Shalom which is a centerpiece in Olam Haba. That's the way, that's the manifestation of the Bnei Shalom that we will have in Olam Haba. You see. Which is an amazing thing. And listen to this. That what happened was when Adam Rishon the Chet and Manoach and the Shechina went into the Klippa, Olam Haba went into the Klippa. That's what it means. It was the Yerida of Olam Haba itself into the Klippa. It means the Sultan just doesn't have Rishus over Adam, or the Sultan suddenly has Rishus over Olam Haba itself, in that sense. Because Kaviyachal, when the Shechina went in the Klippa, the Sultan now has koyach over the entire Kedusha in that sense. You know, he's Ma'akiv, the whole Kedusha and that all of Olam Haba. That's the significance of Shechina B'Gelusa. That's what it means. And what happens is, just as critically, that when that goes out, when Mashiach ben Yosef goes out, the Shekhinah is liberated. The Shekhinah then goes out, which means that for the first time since Adam Rishon, the Shekhinah is truly out. It was also out by Moshe Rabbeinu, right before the Chet Ego, but it then goes out and it's completely free. That's the major achievement in Yetzirah Klippa of Mashiach ben Yosef. See, to undo the Klippa on its own neshama is to undo the Klippa on the Yechidah. But the Yechidah is fundamentally the one neshama which went in with the Shekhinah. Why? Because the Yechidah, which is the Malchus of the Mashiach ben Yosef, that's the neshama which comes down on the Mashiach ben Yosef and makes him the Mashiach ben Yosef, right? That neshama is the lens which is able to focus on the Shekhinah and bring down the awe of Torah. You see, the awe of Pnimi, he's able to bring down the Torah to B'tzur Zaketa, the Torah out of the Klippa, the Torah in a much higher form. Why? Because the Yechidah is the lens, it's the neshama, it's the lens from that neshama, by possessing that neshama, by the Mashiach possessing that neshama. He has the ability to see into Magali Yechudai, and all from the Shekhinah itself. You see, that's the unique relationship between the Mashiach and the Shekhinah. It's the Yechidah which relates the two. Well, that's why when the Shekhinah went into the Golus, in the Klippa, the Yechidah went in, you see. When the Mashiach removes himself from the Klippa, and therefore the Klippa lifts itself off from the Yechidah, it lifts itself off from the Shekhinah. And now we begin to start the Emes Yemos Mashiach, you see. But that's why the removal process is the first critical phase. Once it's removed and Mashiach is out, the Yechidah is out, and the Shekhinah is out, now starts the next process, which is what? The Yerida of the Yechidah on the Mashiach itself. And that we come to the second process, what's called the Yerida of the Yechidah, which is in the Pasuk, which we say, V'nocha Olov, it's from Yeshaya, V'nocha Olov, Ruach Halakim, Ruach Hashem, Ruach Chochma, Bina Eitik Vu, and so on. V'nocha Olov refers to the Yechidah, that they will come down on him. V'nocha Olov, who is Olov? Olov refers to Mashiach ben Yosef, and later on Mashiach ben David. You see, a Ruach will come down with, give him a special das, a special koyach of Eitzik Gavua, Yerushalayim Das, and all these things and so on. That's the Yechidah coming down. And when that comes down, right, the Mashiach ben Yosef becomes the Mashiach ben Yosef. That's when the Shurish takes on that crown, and he's crowned the Mashiach ben Yosef. That constitutes the real start of the Yemos Mashiach. But technically speaking, the real start of the Yemos Mashiach starts from the Yetzirah the Klippa. That's what it is. Now, you may ask, is there a time differential between the two? That's very difficult to answer. And the answer is that there is a time differential. And I saw a very interesting thing. A while back I saw an amazing thing in the name of the Rav Avram Azuloi, who was the father of the Chidah. He wrote a sefer, the Chesed Lavom on Kabbalah. It was a very big Makubal. And he wrote that he heard in the name of Chaim Vital, who was the biggest talent of the Ari, a very interesting thing. What did he hear? He said as well, that the Mashiach ben Yosef, in the Ikrit Mashiach, the last one, will not know that he's the Mashiach ben Yosef. He will not know it. And then later on, he will then come to know it, and when he comes to know it, he will then be in a position, after that, he will remove himself to the Klippa. Once that Klippa is gone, you see, what will happen is that he will enter and go up to the Shemayim for 40 days like Moshe Rabbeinu, to take out the Torah, the Torah to Zaketa, like Moshe did, and bring it down, and then he will have it. But all this will be done in secret. No one will know this. Klal Yisrael will not know this. Now this is an amazing thing what Rav Chaim Vital was saying, is that the process is very similar to the Kabbalah of Torah from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, except that Moshe did it to Fahetia. You see, he did it for Fahetia. Why? Because Klal Yisrael was zeicher to the Yemos Mashiach at that time, Mitzvah Din, because there was still an Achishen at that time, and that's why it could still have been fouled up, which it was by the Chet Ego. But it means that the whole Geula Rishonah had a great deal still was Mitzvah Din. You see, that's why in the end it was lost. Mitzvah case cannot be lost. But Mitzvah Din, once it was Mitzvah Din and Klal Yisrael was Mitzvah Din, they didn't have to be afraid of any kitlut, because they earned it Mitzvah Din. In that case, Moshe could be Megal Torah b'Far Hetzia to all of Klal Yisrael. But since the Yemos Mashiach in the end will not take place in Mitzvah Din, Mitzvah Yichud, and there has to be a constant hesta and a very slow, progressive step, very slowly, inch by inch. You see, it's like the dawn, right? Where the sun, first the rays, and then slowly the rays get brighter and brighter in the dawn. And then suddenly you see the sun itself between the Alos Shachar and the Netzachama, you see, is a certain period of time. So the Gula also takes place very slowly and progressively. So therefore, this whole thing also takes place very slowly and progressively, so that the Gila of the Torah Ketza of Mashiach ben Yosef, which is the Urish of Mashiach, you see, which is the Mashiach having Yechida, will also be done very progressively, and only by himself first, privately. So therefore, the amazing thing is that as soon as he goes out of Yechida, out of the Klippa, there will be a slight period of time, and then a Kedusha will begin to descend, which is the Yechida, and he will go up into the Shemayim to be Makabel the Torah like Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Torah in the Kabbalah is the Urish of Mashiach itself. And that he will then bring down. And with that, he will be then in the perfect position to bring the Geula to all of Klal Yisrael. The Ramchal says a very fascinating thing. The Ramchal says that the koyach of every Gadol Hador, in every generation, right, has a nitzitz from the Shechina. There's a certain koyach or hashpah of the Shechina that gives the koyach of all the Gedolei Hador to function. But the Ramchal says an amazing thing. He says that in the end, by the Trei Mashiach, by the Moshe Mashiach, the Trei Mashiach and Moshe Rabbeinu, a very interesting thing happened. That normally, when Klal Yisrael is b'tikunam, right? It's b'tikunam, like by the end of the Beis HaMikdash, the Shechina comes down on the Beis HaMikdash itself. When I mean the Shechina, I don't mean the full extent of the Shechina. The hashpah, a certain chelik, an aspect of it, which is present there. But it's not mugbul to that makom. It's simply, it's present, a certain aspect of its koyach is on the Beis HaMikdash, you see. But in the Moshe Mashiach, it won't be a mugbul thing, it will be much more powerful. Its full koyach will be down, but not even then not fully, because its full koyach is only revealed in Olam Haba. The name of the Shechina is Olam Haba. Which means that even in Yemot Mashiach, the full extent of the Shechina is not here. You see? In that kind of sense. But what the Ramchal says, the Ramchal says that in the Yemot Mashiach, by the Trei Mashiach, and Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben David, and Moshe Rabbeinu, the Shechina will come down and rest on them, like it does in the Beis HaMikdash, which is an incredible thing. I mean, to rest on a person is an unbelievable thing. You see, to rest on a Beis HaMikdash is one thing, you see. But what Ramchal says, that it will come down, when that Yechida comes down, it's going to rest on them, and the Shechina will mamish be sure on them. So, the Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben David, and Moshe Rabbeinu, all three of them, in that state, are mamish like a walking Beis HaMikdash, which is which is an unbelievable zach. That's why you can understand when it says in the Pasuk, it says that the Mashiachim, the Trei Mashiachim, will become very, very big. It says in three different madregas. V'yom, be elevated, v'naso, and lifted, v'gova, and be very high me'od. So the Medrash turns out, I believe Tanchuma says, v'yom, that the Mashiachim will be v'yom, mi'avom avinu, they will be greater than Avom Avinu, v'nasa, they will be higher than Moshe Rabbeinu, v'gova, and it will be higher than who? The last thing, v'gova, mi'malachei hashores. The Madrega, obviously, when the Shechina comes down, it is so powerful that the Madrega of Kedusha is higher than the Malach HaShoresh itself. You see, and that all comes with Yerid of the Yechida and the Aliyah of the Shechina out of the Klippa to be reflected on the Mashiach themselves. This is obviously an incredibly powerful event, an unbelievably powerful event that will transpire at that time. As we have said, Yerid of the Yechida implies critical things. The Mashiach ben Yosef first must get himself out of the Klippa, and he does that. We explain to some degree what that entails or what that implies. Nothing can happen until the Mashiach ben Yosef has established a state of Tahara for himself first. Nothing can happen before that. Once that is established, and that specifically exists, we come on to the second step of the Gula to the Mashiach ben Yosef himself, not to the Bria yet. The Bria doesn't know anything what goes on yet, although there are certain oros that begin to come down at that point already. But fundamentally, no one really knows about all these events as they take place. As soon as the Yetzirah happens, then starts the event which we know as the Bias HaMashiach. Now, it's an interesting question of when does the Bias HaMashiach actually start? As I have said, technically speaking, the Eschaz of the Gula starts by the Gula Haguf. When Chai Yisrael is Zurcha back to its Guf, which is Eretz Yisrael, that technically is the Eschaz of the Gula. But that is not technically yet the Bias HaMashiach, because the Bias HaMashiach is related to the Gula of the Neshama. You see, when does the Gula of the Neshama actually technically begin to start? It starts not with the Yerid of the Chida, but with the Yesir from the Klippa. That alone is the most incredible event that really can occur. The rest of it really occurs in a certain sense as the beginning of the progression. Once the Yesir and the Klippa takes place, the Yechida is released. It's released from the Klippas. It is now free. Now, what is that Klippa? As we said, what is that? I'm sorry, the Yechida. Yechida, as we said, is the neshama that Adam Rishon once possessed. It's the highest part of the neshama that Adam Rishon once possessed, which he never had. It never came down before the Chet. He was never Zercha to have that part yet. He would have had it if he would not have done the Chet, because then he would have been the Mashiach. But since he was not Zercha to do it, what happened was that part stayed up in the Shemayim. And that part of the neshama is the part of the neshama which is connected to the awe of the Shekhinah itself. And you cannot be Teufus, the Torah in its Pneumius, or in Yemot Mashiach, or the Torah Zichar in Elam Haba, without that neshama called Yechida. Every Yid in Klal Yisrael has that neshama, but that neshama is all a part of the main big Yechida which comes out of Mashiach. The Yechida that we're talking about that goes out of the Klippa is the Yechida of Adam Rishon itself. It's the Yechida HaKlolis. You see, that goes down, descends onto the Mashiach himself. Once he has that Yechida, it then, in a certain sense, either fragments or not fragments, but in a certain sense, it begins to go to every Yid in Klal Yisrael, so that every Yid then has his own Yechida. But the Yechida that every Jew possesses is a fragment of the Yechida that the Mashiach himself possesses. So therefore, every Yid must come on to the Mashiach for the Eretz. The awe, Hagonas, and the awe of the Yemot Mashiach, the awe that will be in that time. And we spoke about this at length, what that awe is like. Can only come through the Mashiach himself. You see. Once that Yechid is removed from the Klippa, simultaneously the Shekhinah is also uplifted and goes out of the Klippa. And now the world is in a state where it can begin, you see, it can begin the process of giving back to Klal Yisrael its complete oris. Now, the Yetziah of the Klippa of the Mashiach himself, as we said, is the liberation of the Yechida and of the Shekhinah. But Klal Yisrael yet has not been liberated. Nothing has really started yet. The Yechida comes down onto Mashiach ben Yosef unknowingly to all of Klal Yisrael. And I mentioned before that I saw in the name of Rav Avraham Ziloi, who wrote in the name of Chaim Vital, an amazing thing, that Lost Lovoi, he wrote that in the beginning the Mashiach ben Yosef does not know that he's the Mashiach ben Yosef. But after he understands this Inyan and so on, and then after he's lifted up from the Klippa, right, after that point he is now free of it. He then ascends into the Shemayim for 40 days, and he brings down the Torah B'tzuz HaKeser. And we've explained before, the whole Inyan of Mashiach ben Yosef is to bring down the Torah in its tzura, which that generation needs for its own tikkun. You see, so the Mashiach, therefore, the main function of Mashiach ben Yosef is to take out the Torah from the Klippas itself. That's the critical thing, that the Torah itself lies in the Klippas. When it says in the Gemara, "Va'asidim Torah shetishtachach meYisrael," I don't know if you know that memo. What does the Gemara mean? Tishtachach. What it means, and you may say, well, it means that there'll be fewer Jews learning. That's not what it means at all. Believe me, that memo has been mekuyam 100%. You may say, well, Torah cannot be nishtachach from the world until Torah completely stops from all the Yidden. You're mistaken. Torah is already forgotten among all the Yidden of the world and so on. Why? Because Asidim Torah Yisrael means the following. It means the Torah with its first and with its ois. It means with the ability of looking into Torah and understanding its paninius. So that when you look in the Torah, you suddenly understand the inner meaning of the entire Hashgacha process and the meaning of human history. If we had Torah in its tzura, the tefalta, in its emes tzura, in the way it actually was, and so on, the way Moshe had it in the first luchos, we will be able to understand every aspect of the Hashgacha process, in terms of the beginning of time to the end of time itself. Like it says, by the Moed Mashiach, Every person will understand in the end by the Mashiach why everything happened. How will he understand this thing? He will understand this thing from the Or HaGonos, from this Or which lies in the Torah itself, except that it's hidden, you see. In that sense, the Torah was forgotten in Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael is no more Zercha to this idea. What happened to these Zoros? What happened to that Torah? As I said before, that Torah went into the Klippas. It is now in the hands of Esav, Ishmael, and the Erevav. Basically, mainly the Erevav at this point, who have that particular kind of awe. They hold that awe now. That means they're holding the Klippa. And Klal Yisrael does not have that awe. It has a vestige of it. And I've said many times before, a very important story, that Klal Yisrael, the Yidden are Zoicha to say Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. The Zoicha to say Hashem Echad twice a day, but they're not Zoicha to understand what that means. It's felt in Gili Yechudai. They can only see the Amira. The Hasod of Gili Yechudai is in the hands of the Erevav, it's in the hands of the Goyim. Now, I've explained this, how that is and so on. We won't go into this Barichas. It may sound strange to but the suit and the earth are on the hands of the clip of the Erevav at this point. The Yechida is the liberation of that awe. And this fundamentally, like we said, is the fact that the Mashiach ben Yosef, for 40 days, apparently, he brings down the Torah B'Shuz HaKetzer. Now, I don't know clearly if that means literally or what. Whether actually it sends like Moshe Rabbeinu or not. But it's very important to realize here a number of things. That the Aliyah of the Mashiach ben Yosef to the Shemaim, in other words, his bringing down of the Torah B'Tzuz HaKetzer is the same thing as Maimon HaSinah by Moshe Rabbeinu. You see, the Mashiach ben Yosef is exactly like Moshe Rabbeinu. There is no difference. They're exactly the same. Because Moshe Rabbeinu himself was Mashiach ben Yosef. That was his entire thing and so on. He was supposed to bring the Gula Shlema. He failed to do it because of the Chet of the Ego. So the Mashiach ben Yosef has to do it Be'ita in the end of time. But fundamentally the task is the same. Except that there's a difference. Since by the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, the fundamental criteria or the pivot that ruled the Bria at that time was the end of Nevuah. At that time, the Gilui of the Bodesh Shalom, the Gilui Yehuda was much greater, and the world functioned from the criteria called Nevuah. But after that time, once that time failed, then from then on, a new criteria came to the world called Chochmah. You see, and the Mashiach ben Yosef does not function from Nevuah. He will be Magali Yehudai, and he will bring Gula to the entire Bria Aydei Chochmah, Aydei the Torah itself. You see, not from the Nevuah. That's why it says, the Ramchal is very interesting that the Mashiach, the Tvei Mashiach will not be as great as Moshe Rabbeinu ben Nevuah. Because it says, Shema, we see from this that Navi, Moshe Rabbeinu was and will be the greatest Navi that has ever lived. However, the Mashiach will be greater than Moshe in Chochmah. Why is that? Because at that time in the Bria, when Moshe was alive and the Yidden were alive and the Gula was supposed to come in the Nevuah, the Gilui was supposed to come by a certain kesher that his neshama had to the Shechina, or to the Or Torah in that sense, Machmas Nevuah, Machmas Mara, Machmas Chazoyim. That was a different function, it's a different mode, you see. Once the Gula was not able to come to that mode, you see, and it came to the mode of Chochmah, which is the mode of logic and inference, it's a different kind of mode, then no longer is the Nevuah the Ika mode at all. That's why the Mashiach not as great as Moshe Rabbeinu. You see, because Nevuah is no longer the Ika. If the Mashiach had to be Megala the Torah the Nevuah, then the Mashiach would be as great as Moshe, if not greater. You see, so when the Torah says the Torah was saying the following, that there will never again arise a Navi like Moshe Rabbeinu. Why? Because Klal Yisrael failed in the Gula. That's why. Not because Moshe had some unique quality that although he had the quality of Spakla Amiyah, which is the quality of Mashiach ben Yosef. It's not because he had some unique qualities in the Shema which entitles him to be the greatest Navi of all time. No. He was the greatest Navi of all time because at that time the entire Indian of the Mashiachas was totally in Levius. And once the Mashiachas was lost because Klal Yisrael failed to do it, no longer would Mashiachas be totally in Levius. So Ramela Moshe would keep that as the greatest Navi of all time, you see. And it would go on to the next mode, which is Chochmah. So the Tvei Mashiachim at the end has an Indian of Chochmah, which is all, that's why, and the Gemara says, Chochem Oduf Navi. The Gula that would come in the Chochmah is greater than the Gula that comes in the Nevius. Greater. And there are many, what? Yaskel, yeah. And you see this in the Psukim, we'll get into the Psukim. Hine Yaskel of the Yom V'Nosa, or the Gav Meyorid. By Yeshaya Nun Beis, it says Hine Yaskel, it refers to the Mashiach. that the Mashiach will be Yaskel, he will establish a level of Haskalah. His level of, he will achieve the highest Madriga that's capable, which is higher than Malach HaShoas, to Haskalah, which is not Nevuah. You see, that's right. Why? Because the Nevuah, the Art of Lavoy, Be'ita, is only through Chokhmah. You see, and we have said that before that the Gula that happens on the Chokhmah, Das, is much greater than the Gula that happens on the Nevi'as. Why? Because of the fact that it has a much greater power against the Satan himself, much greater power against the Zoyama. And that's how the Mashiach ben Yosef will be able to bring a Madriga of the Moaz Deis Hashem K'mayim Liyam Chasem. You see, at that time Moshe brought the Gilui to Nevi'as and to Nitzim, but the Mashiach ben Yosef will not use Nitzim, at least not in the beginning, in that sense. He will be able to Magala the Yad Hashem, to appease him of the Chochmah itself. Every Umolas Deis Hashem, every Yid is going to sit down and understand why the Bon Hashem is the Melech. He won't have to be shown it, you know what, B'mare, and he won't also, he even will have Nevuah. But it will not come on Yidei Nevuah. He doesn't have to sit down. He doesn't have to be shown to Mara and to meet him that the Bon Hashem has Yad Hashem. He will understand it claw, like 2 and 2 is 4. He will clearly exactly why the Bon Hashem exists, that he exists, and he will understand the Hashkoch itself, Metoch Chochmah Amuka, and that will become known through the Torah B'Tzuz HaKeser. The Torah B'Tzuz HaKeser is the Torah that the Mashiach ben Yosef will bring down. That's what it means in Yaskalavdi, and we're going to get into that at length. So fundamentally, this is a very important thing to understand, that the Mashiach that happened by the time of Moshe was the Nevuah, which is inferior to the Mashiach that will happen Be'ita later on, which is B'Chokhmah. Now you may say, why should it be, if it's both a Geula, why should it be inferior? So we said also the other time as well, that you have to remember as well, that the Gula at that time was much more Tali B'Achishena, and now it's much more Tali Be'ita. Because of that, if you have to wait 2,000 years longer for the Gula, even though there's a disadvantage in having to wait so long, for Tzina Golas, but there's also an advantage, in a sense. The advantage of having to wait is what we said a long time before, in a certain sense, is that, remember, that when the Moshe Mashiach starts, that is not the end of the story. That's only the next half. There are 2 functions that the Bria must do. The tikkun of the Bria lies in 2 areas. In the tikkun of to matar the Bria, to remove the zoyama, the tumor that Adam brought him because of the chet, and also the masach and the chasson that the Baruch Hashem created the Bria with, even for other missions before the chet. So he should raise the Bria to the level of Olam Haba. You see. Now, if they had achieved the Geula at that time, then he would have been matar the Bria, which Moshe was able to do. But they would have still had a certain ways to go to bring the world up to a level of zichuch. But if the entire process has to go for another 2,000 years or 3,000 years, what happens is that as the tahara is going on to matar Yisrael from the chet of the Erev Vav, of the chet of the Egel, but at the same time they are also accomplishing the in of zichuch at the same time. So by the time the Moshe Mashiach actually does start, not only will the Bria have a complete tahara, but it will already have achieved 99% also of the tikkun of the zichuch of the Bria, which is the job of Mashiach ben David. You see, this is the ikazach. So that's why the Moshe Mashiach that will happen at the end will be even greater than the madreg of other mission kodim achet. Now, what we know from the Psukim is that how is this supposed to happen? The Mashiach ben Yosef is supposed to be Kabul, the essence, the union of the Torah B'Tzuz HaKeser. What is the Torah B'Tzuz HaKeser? It's the Orish Mashiach, it's the Ordonis. It's the ability to see the Pneumius and of the Torah and the Chatzonis in such a way that the entire all the Torah is opened up. So from the Torah becomes a complete textbook on why everything has happened in all of human history, from the beginning of time to the end, clearly right in front of us. We say that's fundamentally what is established. Now, how does Mashiach ben Yosef bring down that kind of a gilui, that kind of an or? He brings down that kind of an or, of course, only after he's out of the klipa, and that all becomes shaykh to him because the yechida comes down on him, and that's what it says in the pasuk. It says v'nochal lo v'ruch alakim. It says in the pasuk in Yeshaya that the ruach of the Monishim will go on him, a ruach chochmah, bina v'das, eitz gvur, v'yis Hashem, a whole bunch of things and so on. This refers to the yechida, that when yechida comes down on Mashiach ben Yosef, and later on Mashiach ben David, in that sense, or at that time Mashiach ben David, there's a tremendous aliyah. There's an aliyah where he's massive greater and greater levels of chachma. Now, what's important to understand is that when the Mashiach is in the klipa, he's referred to as the Mashiach bekulkuloi. It's Mashiach in a state of kilkul. Once he goes out of the klipa and he goes into a state of what? Of the Yechidus come down, that's called the Mashiach B'tikunoi. And Klal Yisrael has the parallel moves here. What the Ramchal says, very interesting in Kinas Hashem Tzvokot, is the following. That even though the Mashiach is B'kilkuloi, when the Mashiach is still deeply buried in the klipa, and so on, the Ramchal says, he's still, now you may think, what's his matzah then, when he's buried in the klipa? What shaykhs does he have to the Agonas? You see, the answer is that even though he's in the klipa, since he will be the Mashiach who will finally bring the Geula, he is already connected to the Yechida. You see, that's the whole problem. Why is it that the Mashiach ben Yosef is in such a state of kilkul? Where does it come from? Where does such a tremendous state of hashchosa or kilkul come on the Mashiach and the Mashiach ben Yosef? Where does it come from, such a thing? Like it says in the Psukim, Kinei Mishchas Me'ishmael V'Torah Me'eldom. Where does the state of hashchosa come from? The state of hashchosa comes to Klal Yisrael, we understand. Why does Klal Yisrael have hashchosa? They have hashchosa because they're chotoyim. They do chatoyim, that's where the hashchosa comes. They have tremendous klippet on them. But where does such a neshama like the Mashiach have shaykhs to these things? So what we said is that the Mashiach is called the Sovi Chaloyim. It means that the Mashiach experiences this thing not because he has a klipa which is dovet in, because he hasn't done any chet, but the klipa is mislabish. His neshama is totally surrounded with tremendous force of Torah, with the deepest level of the zoyma of all existence surrounds the neshama of the Mashiach. What's the neshama of the Mashiach? It surrounds the Yechida, because it's the Yechida which is in the klipa. The Malchus, the Melech HaMashiach is in the klipa. You see. Now in every generation there's a person who is supposed to be the Mashiach. But if that Shurish is not connected to the Adonas, then that Mashiach will not experience that level of kilkul. Because it's the Yechida which is in the klipa. Hence it's Yechida which has the Ashchosa. You see. So therefore it is the final Mashiach, in a sense. The one who actually will become the Mashiach, who actually therefore becomes actually connected to the Yechida. But the problem is that he's connected to the Yechida while the Yechida is still in the klipa. Hence, just like the Tumah surrounds the Yechida, in that sense, since he's connected to the Yechida, since he will be the final Mashiach, and Yechida will eventually descend on him, he himself takes on a tremendous hashchosa and tsar, which the Yechida is also sovel. So the sovel are together. That's why the Mashiach ben Yosef is sovel the entire klipa while he's alive. As a person, even before he becomes the Mashiach. And that's it. That's where he gets the hashchosa from. But since that's where he gets the hashchosa from, that's also his kiyum. And Ramchal says a very interesting thing. Ramchal says, how, with all this tremendous tumah on top of a neshama, how is it time for such a neshama to survive? Period. So what the Ramchal says, it survives because the union of what's called the Vov. The Vov, the letter Vov, Vov, Aleph, Vov. The letter Vov, it spells like that. And fundamentally, the letter Vov is the symbol of the Or Adonos, of the Or Pnimi. When it says, if it's Chat is Brit Yaakov, Yaakov is the Vov. The Vov. And what it is that the two Vov itself is repetition. You have Vov, it's spelled Vov, Aleph, Vov. That's how Vov is spelled. This Vov is the Mashiach ben Yosef, the Mashiach ben David, and the Aleph is Mechaber, the two of them. The Achtus of the Bria. Because the 20 Mashiachim bring the entire union of the Malchus of the Bonisham itself. You see. So what it is, that since the Mashiach ben Yosef, in the last one, is connected to the Yechida, and he's in a state of this hashchosa, he's also connected to the Yechida, so he's also makabel the earth of the Yechida, even while he's in the Klippa. You see. So it's a double thing. On one side he has the hashchosa of the Yechida, on the other side he has the tremendous awe of the Yechida. But he doesn't have it greatly. He only has it in a tremendous symptom. You see. It is that symptom. It's slight awe, like droplets of the Or Adonis which comes down on the Mashiach ben Yosef while he's in the Klippa. That's which allows him to survive in that Klippa. That's the only thing. It's called the Vav. The Or, that Vav, of that Or Adonis which comes down on the Mashiach ben Yosef allows him to survive while he's in that Klippa. You see. So therefore the same matter which brings the Ashchosa, the Kilkul, also brings the Oris itself. Now in the state of the Kilkul, in the state of when the Mashiach ben Yosef is in the Klippa, that Vov, that Or, the Adonis, is a tremendous tsar for the Mashiach, because it only drops come down. Ramchal says that Madrega is called Samach. Samach. The letter Samach symbolizes the level of the Mashiach in the Klippas, of the Mashiach in the state of Kilkul, right, with slight droplets of the Ohagonas. You see. Now, even though those slight droplets, they are very powerful. They are very, very powerful. And that alone enables them to see things which no other human being really can see. Just that alone. But obviously, since there's only drop after drop in that kind of sense, obviously it's impossible to go further. And he cannot go further. The Mashiach ben Yosef in the Kilkul, in the Kilkul, when the Chid is still in the Klippa, cannot go above the level of Samach, or the level of those one oils. Those oils of the Yechida are just enough to allow them to save themselves, to have a kiyum, and enough, you see, also to give them a certain level of tzar. When he goes out of the Klippa, when the Yechida goes out of the Klippa, and suddenly he's freed, he suddenly elevates to the next level called sin. Is represented by the letter sin. And that's in the word Hine Yaskil Avdi. Russian sin. You see, the sin represents the next level. Actually, it represents the immediate level which happens from the Yetziah to the Klippa. As soon as the Yechida comes down, right? It comes down, as soon as it's free from the Klippa, and it goes on top of the Mashiach ben Yosef, it is then in the madreg of sin. That's what it means. Hine Yaskil Avdi. Suddenly, the Gula starts. That's the real beginning of the Gula. You see, although the Gula technically actually starts by the Yetziah and the Klippas, but the real beginning of the Bias HaMashiach as we know it, or as we begin to experience, is the union of the Yaskal Abdi. That the Mashiach ben Yosef begins to experience the Yechida in that level. Now, what happens then? Then it begins to progressively get stronger and stronger. That's why the pasuk says, "Hine Yaskal Abdi v'yom v'nasa v'gov miyoy." It progressively becomes greater and greater until it gets to the highest madrega. What's the highest madrega? It's symbolized by the letter Shin. And that letter, the madrega, is the madrega of the Or HaGonas itself. It is the full Or HaGonas. It is the full power of the Orish Mashiach turned on, which means that at that point in time, the awareness of the Mashiach ben Yosef is absolutely staggering, because it means that the Shekhinah is then totally sure on him.